All right, let me bump this up a little. OK, cool. So thank you for the introduction. I'm Sid. Let me start my stopwatch because I suck at being on time. OK, so I'm Sid. I'm an independent developer. I have no idea what that means. I used to work at the design system team at Auth0 until last month. So I'm kind of unemployed, but I didn't want to write unemployed because you don't want to take tips from an unemployed person. So I'm an indie dev. Right? Follow me on Twitter. There's some useful stuff, mostly shitposting. And I build tools and services for front-end developers. That's kind of what I do. These are some of the things I built. They're OK. They're not bad. We got 7 million downloads, so they must be OK. And I'm going to skip to the next. So I'm going to talk about refactoring React from good code to great code. Right? You can also call this yak shaving, bike shedding, unpopular opinions, etc. Right? Pick your clickbait title. Cool. Think of it as this pair programming with everyone, and you're allowed to if I'm doing something wrong, please shout at me nicely, and cool. So can you read the code? Is it big enough? Yeah? All right. I can't hear you, sorry. I'm going to zoom in a little more. All right, nice. So this is like a login form thing. You come here, you enter your password, and then you get in, right? It seems to know where you're coming from, probably from an email, so it knows my name. And then there's this satisfying remember me toggle there. And if you look at the state, you kind of see this thing where, it's a class component. So the first thing you see is a constructor. You start reading its state. And it has this thing which is, puts the name in state from props, right? And the moment you see props being used inside the constructor like state, it's a code smell, right? A code smell is something, it's like an indication that there might be something wrong with your code. Not saying there is, but there could be, right? It's a code smell. It's not a bug. So every time you see props inside the constructor like this, it's probably a code smell. What we're doing here is we're going through props.user.name. It's like a long thing, so you want to just grab it and store it in the state. And if we don't know who it is, then we just say you, like welcome back you, right? Hey you, right? We don't know who it is. Maybe we just have that email or something. Anywho, so we store it over here. The biggest problem with this is that when props.user changes, this is not going to run again, right? The constructor only runs once. So the component is changed, but your message will still be the same because the constructor is not called. And then you will probably have to do something like component will receive props, unstable, get derived state from props, which I never learned how to use. But anywho, the better thing to do here is let's just not put it into state. If we can infer it, we should infer it. So you just say put it in the render block, and then we can use it over here. Right? Perfect. Still works? Doesn't work. This dot props. Stupid classes. All right, perfect. Let's move on. Another code smell over here is that you see the switch component. So switch components are nice, right? By the way, where do we stand on putting these switch components? Should we put it inside the form? Because it's these are the two input fields, and then you have the submit button. But it kind of looked wonky here, so everyone just puts it after the button, and then I don't know where the semantic police is on this, because it's inside a form, but after, sorry. Anyway, there's an on-click over here, right? And which makes sense. You click this thing, and it kind of toggles. But again, every time you see a interaction, like an on-click or on-key press on a reusable component like switch, it's a code smell, right? Not saying something is wrong, but something could be wrong. The idea here is that whoever wrote this probably only thought about the on-click case. They didn't think about accessibility, that you can also use your tab and kind of use a spacebar. Or if you're on mobile, you're probably trying to drag it and it's not working. So the idea here is that if it's an interaction, you don't want, or more you don't want it to be an interaction, you want it to be a behavior, right? So switches don't toggle, switches don't click, switches probably toggle, right? So you say on toggle. And then you go into the switch and make sure that it reads that and does all of the things, right? Does it for click, does it for drag, does it for all of the interactions. So the idea here is that you should name behaviors as prop, not interaction. Now, on toggle is a decent prop, right? Switches toggle. But if you look at this input, we have an on change, right? We don't call it on key press, which is cool. We also don't call it on fill. We call it on change. And we kind of accidentally all agreed on change because there's an HTML attribute called on change, right? And there's this excellent talk by Sebastian Mark Boga. I hope that's how we pronounce his name. So Sebastian's talk from all the way back from 2014, he gave a talk about minimal API surface area. And it's a great talk. You should check it out. It's on YouTube. And the idea that he proposed was, you want to minimize the number of things a developer has to learn before he or she can be effective with their code, right? So if you keep adding new props, you have to know that, OK, the input uses an on change, but the switch uses an on toggle, right? It's like your prop, like with React components, props is the API surface that you have. So my suggestion here is just use on change, right? Let's just like normalize all of them and call, if it's an input element of any kind, like a select or a switch or an input text, let's just call it on change. Cool. So this works now. Let's see, what else do we got here? There is so much bad code here. I probably wrote it last week. OK, let's look at this one. So we've got this on submit, right? And on submit's fine. Like it calls event or prevent default. Otherwise, it would be like a server post request, which we don't want. And then it does a props.onSubmit. This looks OK, but then we pass it to another form, right? So this is like a reusable form component. And we kind of do some onSubmit magic in this login form. So this is also a code smell. This code smell has a name. It's called FeatureEnv. It's when one component is too interested in the functioning of its child component, right? And you want to make sure that to make it changeable, to make it nicely changeable, I'm going to steal Dan's word because that makes a successful talk, this quote Dan Abramov. So he wrote a really good blog post. It's a small blog post. We all can read it. Don't worry about it. It's called Optimize for Change. And the core idea behind it that don't just build your components on what you see today. Build them with like enough walls so that even when the surroundings change, your component continues to work. So in this case, FeatureEnv kind of violates that. So what I want to do is I want to take this on submit and actually take it to my form component. And this is where it should be, right? The parent shouldn't really care about how forms are submitted. So this looks good. Let me just make sure I change it over here. Yeah, this should be this.props because we don't do anything else here. Perfect. That looks good. Now, while we're in this component, there's also a code smell here. Why does it not like it? OK. Props. Sweet. So when you're looking at a reusable component and you look at the JSX for it, and if it doesn't have something like this, like it doesn't spread the props, that's a code smell, right? Not saying there's a bug, just that there could be a bug. And the idea here is that it works right now, but if you don't have this spreading of props, if you want to add something like an ID, like my form, or more realistically, something like a data test ID, right? Then this wouldn't actually go to the component. My favorite way of adding something and checking it works is adding a red background, right? Background red, nice. And as you see, nothing happens because we don't actually accept props. We just care about props for children on submit because that's what I thought about when I was writing this component. But it's a good practice to kind of put all of this here. Sweet. And you see it's red, and it kind of accepts it, right? I do this so often that I have a class name for this in every project I work on. So I just call it class name red, which has like a slightly prettier shade of red. And now you see that it kind of screwed up the alignment, right? Let me go back. Right? You see the form is like nice and designed, but now the padding's gone. It's all wonky width. That's because when you have this props, and like if you are paying attention in Kent's talk, then you already know what happened here, which is when this opens up to React.createElement, it's going to put a class name, and then it's going to spread these props, and again put a class name that the user gave, right? So we basically just overwrote it. Same thing goes for onSubmit. When you give this onSubmit, right, we're actually overriding everything that comes before it. So all of this is dead code. It's like it's not even there. So the order of props is really important. We want our onSubmit to be before it, so we can do this. And now the class name is the default, then comes the props, and then our onSubmit is more important than the users on submit. This is kind of still stupid, so let's make this. We want to kind of, now this is more like a design decision. Do we want the user of this form component to be able to customize it, right? If not, then let's just put props first and then our class name after, right? This is like a screw you. The designer said this is how it looks. You're not allowed to add any class names to it. Usually that's not the case. Usually you want to accept class name and like merge the two. So what we're going to do here is say form, and then I'm going to put a class name, right? And this class name I'm going to destructure from up here and then say rest of the props. So what I'm doing is I'm taking out the class name so that there are no conflicts anymore, and then I say apply the props, then apply my class name, and then apply the onSubmit, right? So every time you see this, reusable component which doesn't have this spread, it's a code smell. Just beware on the order that you want to put it. Cool, let's see what else do we got. Okay, oh, nice. Okay, there's something that I'm doing over here. So this login form has this remember. Wait, let me remove this class. All right, so this component has a remember, right, which is this thing, remember false. And then what I'm doing is I'm toggling it, this dot remember toggle, and remember toggle basically just like switches the state. It's a toggle, right? So there are two fields over here. There is this thing, and there is a password field, right? One of these is control components. We are keeping remember in the state, but we're not really keeping the value of input here. And the reason kind of is because when we submit this form, it goes to its parent, and the parent is interested in the values, right? This component isn't so much interested in the value of the password. So we're mixing controlled state and uncontrolled state, which is, again, usually a bad idea. You have to pick one side. You either put all of your form elements in the state, or you put none of them, and then just grab them from form, right? So for example, here I could have said form.password.value, and that gives me the value of it, right? So pick one. I like to do uncontrolled components. Unpopular opinion, doesn't matter. I'm going to delete remember toggle, and this one, and this one. All right. The core idea is like pick one. Don't have both of them. That usually will lead to a bug one day. Cool. Now that we're here, there's another weird thing happening here. I just feel like I'm deleting all my code, which is probably a good thing. So this login form, we're looking at the constructor. We're looking at what is the data that this login form is interested in. So if it was remember and password, that's fine. But it has this disabled thing, right? Let me show you what this disabled does. It's set to true, and it's set over here in the button. So when there's nothing in the button, that's when the button is disabled, and then you can type stuff, and then it becomes enabled, right? It's like a tiny, nice UX thing. The logic of that is kind of simple. In the on change, we just check if there's nothing in the input, right? The length, the value dot length is 0, then it should be disabled, otherwise it's enabled. And you probably want to change it to like there should be 8 characters, and there should be like an asterisk, and there should be numbers, and there should be blood of your firstborn, and like all of that. But anywho, you pick your thing. I just want it to be filled. I'm happy with that. So the code smell over here is that login form shouldn't really care so much about the UX of the actual form. It should care about login stuff, right? That's in the name. So there's a name for this code smell, or the principle. It's called single responsibility principle, where each component should just do one thing and do it well, and should delegate the rest to a different component. So in this case, we want to just take out the UX part of this into a different, outside the component. So we can do a higher order component. Higher order component works like this. You put I'm going to say add smartness, right? And you wrap the component. So let's write this, add smartness. It receives a component. And it's supposed to return a smart component. So I'm going to say enhance is too hard to type, smart component. Smart component extends React component. And the best part about React is you can just like copy paste stuff, which is, to be honest, most of coding anyways. So I can take this entire constructor and on change. This is the part which deals with the smartness. I can cut this, paste it here, and then inside my render function, I want to render this original component that you gave, right? So return component, And we want to pass our disabled, right? So the things that we just did, this dot state dot disabled, and the on change, this dot on change. Now there's a code smell here already, which is all of the props that come to the original component are not forwarded through, which we should. And so we can just say this dot props. And then they forward through. Perfect. Now let's go back to our enhance component. And yeah, this doesn't come from over here. This comes from props. And disabled comes from props. Does it work? OK, I think so. OK. Let's just test. So there is also a code smell. Like, we've done a good thing, which is we've extracted the UX logic out of a login form. Login form only cares about login stuff, like password and remember. But the fact that we're using a higher order component itself is like a low-key code smell, right? It's not a bug. It's only a code smell. Please don't at me. The idea here is that if there was a on change or a disabled coming from the parent, we just overrode it, right? And we don't really, at this enhanced stage, we don't really know if this was something from the parent. We're just blindly overriding it, which is usually a bad thing. If we switch this around, then our logic wouldn't work. The parent will override it, so it's kind of like a mess, right? The most annoying part about this is when you're looking at the component and you're trying to debug what's not working, you're actually just looking at one constraint space, which is props. And the parent is adding to this props, and so is the higher order component. And it can get really hairy. Like, you might have a Redux connect over here, and then you have like layers of higher order components, all of them just adding things to props. One of the approaches is that you just like namespace them, right? You say smart disabled, smart on change. I kind of hate that from the sole reason that I don't like Java, and Java has like namespacing. So bad memories there. But a better thing to do here would be to create a new scope, right? What we really want is just like, we still want the variables, but we don't want them props. Also, I just realized that this function doesn't have a constructor or no lifecycle methods, which means it doesn't have to be a class component. So I'm just going to create a functional component over here, which is my favorite thing right now. Taking class components and making them function components is awesome. Perfect. And then you got to delete some this. Sweet. Everything broke? Good. That's supposed to happen. All right, there we go. Another diff. Perfect. Back. Yeah, so what I want to do here is, instead of using a higher order component, I can use a render prop. And the render prop has like a slightly verbose API. Hooks do the same thing. So let's convert this whole thing into a hook. So this smart component, I'm going to call it function use smartness, because it has to start with use. And inside this, we're going to say disabled and set disabled. Oh, by the way, this is kind of like a scary refactor. So it would be really cool if we had tests, right? That's also, by the way, a code smell. If you don't have tests, that's a code smell, right? And let's be honest, you probably don't have tests, because who has time for that, right? So this is kind of like something I do, which is just before I'm about to do a big refactor, I write just the tiny amount of tests that will get me through this refactor, right? Doesn't matter if you have a healthy test suite or 100% code coverage. Nobody has time for that. So just write enough tests so that this block works, right? I'm not going to bore you with that. I actually already wrote tests. So I have a test here, which using React testing library. Thanks, Ken. This is amazing. And I stop the user. And what we do here, I really want you to look at the API, because I think it's really cool. We say render the login form, give it the stub thing. And then we say button is component, the thing we rendered, get by text, right? So you're not actually adding data IDs, or you're not trying to figure out, OK, the first element and the next child of that. There's no path-related stuff. It's just what the user sees. So we can refactor our code, and our tests would still run, right? That's, by the way, like a major code smell, that if you feel that every time you make a change in your component, your tests also need a change, which kind of makes them useless, that's a code smell. That means your tests are probably not very nice. In this case, our tests are perfect, because they don't really care about the implementation detail. They just care about like what the user sees, like get by text. So this is the button. And then we expect the button to be disabled by default, which is perfect. And then my next test renders the component again and says, fire an event on this input and just add some value, like add A. And then when you look at the button, it should not be disabled anymore, right? Basically just this behavior. Cool, so now that we magically have tests which are passing, let's convert this into a hook. OK, so hook should look like this. It's called useSmartness, and it has a state pair, disabled, set disabled, and we say react.useState. How many folks already use hooks, like on production and stuff? Oh, nice. Awesome. And then the default state for this is true, because we want it to be disabled by default. And then I'm going to copy paste this on change. Whoop. Let's get it here. Put a const here, const on change. And then this line just should be set disabled, right? Set disabled and set the disabled value. And then from this, we can return the only two things we care about in this function, which is disabled and on change. I'm going to delete my higher order component and then use this smartness over here. Perfect. Const disabled and on change, that's the two things it returns. Those are the two things we care about. Use, and voila. Now, over here, our tests have failed. Nice. So we at least have something here. What did I do? Add smartness is not defined. Oh, it's on the higher order thing. Yeah. Let's get rid of that. Perfect. So now, in on change, we don't really take it from props. We take it from useSmartness. It's local scope now, so we can remove this. And now we don't really have the same conflicts that we did with higher order component. That's awesome. I would also like to pass the default value. Right? If this useSmartness is going to be generic enough, then it should take a prop for, or take an argument for the default thing. Test will pass, we're good. Now, one thing that's kind of obvious is that you might have multiple hooks, right? We might create another one over here for maybe the remember field, and then we kind of, again, are looking at the same disabled and on change, so there could be conflicts. The fun thing about this hooks, or the standard, or I shouldn't say standard, the popular API with hooks is that you're always returning arrays, and with array destructuring, you can call this whatever you want. So I can actually call this on password change, right? And this would still work. It doesn't matter what the hook returns. The hook returning could call it whatever we want, or whatever it wants, and we can rename it right here. You can do it with object destructuring as well, but this just looks nicer. And the test still pass. I'm going to stop showing off that. OK. Perfect. Let's do a submit. Hope it works. Sweet. All right. So now we come to the next page, where you have this alert, and it says you need to click the something boring. Look, let's open the code for that. So the idea here is that if your profile is not verified, right? If it's verified, then show null. Otherwise, show this alert. And every time you see a component, like a JSX rendered block, which has a prop but doesn't really have any children, it's a code smell, right? There could be something wrong, not saying there is. So let's open the alert and see what's up. Yeah, as I suspected, it's stupid. So you see props.message here, which is what the content inside it is, right? Coming back to like the minimal surface area angle, we just invented a new prop where we had props.children, right? Props.children is literally for putting content inside components, and it's something that we all already know. So we don't really have to put this message, right? And it's kind of tempting to put that because it makes sense for the alert. But if you look at your entire component, if you look at your entire code base together, it doesn't really make sense to add new props for things like this. Another side effect of this is if we wanted to add an icon, right? We probably, in the previous version, we probably would have done it like this. You put an icon, or if you're feeling adventurous, you do something like this, icon, you put a component there. The fun thing about this is that when you put something like this, you also have to go to alert and then support it, right? We'll have to write something like, if there is a props.icon, then add an icon, right? You kind of convolute it. Instead, the moment you pick children, you've automatically made it like flexible for future change, whereas you can just drop this inside the child and you get this icon, right? It's way better than if you had a message which only takes a string, right? So again, like tiny plug, optimize for change, and don't create new props unless you have to. So this comes with like a big caveat. That's why I say it's like a code smell, not a bug. Maybe you actually wanted to restrict that. Maybe your design system guidelines actually say, you can't add an icon, right? Alerts are only text, please don't do that. In that case, it's actually a good idea to put a message prop and have like a hard prop types check on that this can only be a string, and put a hard prop type check on children and say, no children. You don't get to do that, right? All right, let's kind of scroll down a little. So there's like a silly UX thing here, which is if my account is not verified, I shouldn't be able to save all of this information. It doesn't make sense. So what I want to do is disable all of these fields. Now, one way to do that could be I just take props.verified and I start adding disabled. Right? Add disabled to this, add disabled to this, and it's kind of annoying to do it for all of them. So it would be really cool if our form took a disabled and then pass it on to the children, right? Which it does, and it's cool. So you pass a disabled over here, and it goes all the way. Let's look at the form code. And the way it does that, it loops through the children, right? So you have react.children.map. By the way, if you use props.children.map, if you just have one child, it wouldn't be able to map because JSX would just give you one. But react.children.map would convert into an array. That's like a tiny tidbit. So when you do this, and then you loop through each of the child, and you say, if props.disabled for the form is there, then clone the element, and then pass this extra prop, right? This is kind of like a semi-popular, but also kind of scandalous approach. Every time you see react.clone element, it's a code smell. Not saying it's a bug, calm down, but it could be a bug, right? There is a problem. There could be a problem. So the thing to be aware of is, let me show you with an example. So you see this show email on profile. It doesn't make sense to show this if you don't even have your email entered, right? So I just want to add this extra check and say, if there is an email, only then show this. Otherwise, just show null. And of course, like React will complain, we need to wrap this with something. So maybe I can wrap this with a div, right? And you see it kind of becomes enabled. Like this is not disabled like the other ones anymore. It's because when you do a map, you're only doing a map on the children, right? Not their grandchildren. So the moment you add a wrap over here, it doesn't work anymore because it's adding a disable to this div, not really the actual input. So like I hear some of you, it's like, shouldn't add a div, maybe we should add fragment, right? The funny thing is fragment also doesn't pass down. It's like a DOM wrapper, right? So it will disappear when you render it, but it's not going to pass all the props inside, right? So that's why I say this is like a code smell. And the solution here could be, instead of using clone element, let's use context. If we can, then let's use context. So let me just create a quick context here. Do I have time for that? Yeah, I got it. Form context. Form context is react.createContext, create context, and we'll have an empty value. And then we can wrap all of our components with a provider, right? So you give a provider here, and you wrap all of them. And then we can add a value. We can just pass the disabled value over here, right? So what we're doing is we're basically giving it to all the children and all the grandchildren, right? The way I like to do this is just add it to the form itself. So I say form.context and wrap it here, so that now when I go to my switch component, I can actually say, I created a hook for it, which is use form context and get disabled. And what this does is it first takes disabled from props. So props gets default priority. And then we say, if there is context, by the way, react.useContext kind of gets rid of the render prop API. This is awesome. So you say react.useContext, you get the form context. If there is a form context, which is if this field is used inside a form, then you can get disabled from there. If it is not used inside a form, we don't want this to break, so that's why we just want to check it, and then it just fallbacks to props.disabled. Cool, so you get disabled, and now it still works even though we have like multiple layers. So every time you see a clone element, you kind of have to ask yourself, do I need a clone element or do I need a context? I spent some time trying to explain it, but then Ryan Florence tweeted this in the morning and kind of did that for me, so I'm just going to say what he did, which is to help you decide between clone element or context, think, right? That's the first step, think. I said, does the parent of the component, which is a form, need to know anything about the children? In our case, we don't really control the children, right? Even though all of them are form elements, but we don't really control the structure. So in that case, context makes a lot more sense. But if the answer is yes, for example, if you take a tab, and then inside the tabs, you have each tab. Like you kind of know what's coming in, but not the content inside. Clone element works over there. Speaker plug, it also boils down to the props being passed, which is a great point, that if they're part of the public API, then it makes sense. Otherwise, you have to use context. So awesome, thanks. Yeah, it took me 5 minutes to understand this. Like, good plug. All right, so of course, you're not like all of this information is cool, and so this is the list, right? Don't use state when you can infer name behavior, la la la. You can't remember this. Please don't bother. It's okay. I wrote it over. Go to this link. I kind of just summed it down. All of these articles came from, in one form or the other, from my newsletter. I kind of sent them out over the last 6 months, and then I made a talk out of this. So if you want, you can subscribe to my newsletter, get stuff. All the links are over here, including Sebastian's talk. It's a great talk. Please watch it. Thank you.